The Haunting Tales of Dark Shivering.
Dark Shivering is a quaint village which lies on the English and Welsh border. It is notoriously difficult to find, and with neither Wales or England staking their claim over it, it has been largely forgotten and untouched by outside hands. It was renamed Dark Shivering in the early 1800s to break away from its pagan-rooted original name, which was Witchstow. This roughly translates as Witch's Holy Place, and at the time was no longer deemed appropriate for the village. Each building seems to have its own tale to tell, and with the dark surrounding woodland and long lonely stretches of road, it's not hard to see why people become frightened by the local ghost stories. After many years of staying in Dark Shivering whilst on business, I have managed to amass quite a few stories from the dark side. Here are a few to make you shiver. The Mine. Marvel Bank is an area where independent miners used to pay rent to work their own small mines. They would rent part of the area and mine alone or as a small group for an honest wage. It sits mainly on the outskirts of Dark Shivering, except for a large oval piece that protrudes through the center of the village, almost like an island that has now reverted back to its natural habitat. Oak and fir trees grow all over the hilly landscape, and children use the dips and curves to ride their bikes up and down. Marvel Bank was mined for many years, and as such a few lives were lost along the way. One group of miners were working deep underground when their pit suddenly and furiously began to flood. Their digging had disturbed the ground above, and the nearby lake quickly filled up the shafts with freezing black slurry. None of the men survived. It was never mined again after this tragic incident in the early 1960s. Local men and women say that you can hear the men's cries for help on cold, dark nights, and whilst out walking, people say their dogs have reacted strangely in the area. Reg Parnell and Jimmy Grimes were a pair of local young rascals who never missed the opportunity to help themselves to other people's belongings, whether the owner wanted them or not. One particular night, Reg and Jimmy had heard that someone had dumped a considerable amount of industrial rubbish up on Marvel Bank. The area hadn't been mined for years at this point, and so they felt assured that no one would be up there to witness him up to no good. They waited until it was almost dark and wasted no time in making their way to where someone had dropped off a large pile of old junk. To their disappointment, when they got there, all they found was a lot of empty paint cans and some scrap metal. Nothing was worth their while taking, and so they strolled back towards the village down the old railway line and past the mines on the left. It was twilight by this time, and Jimmy was walking along with his head down, making sure he didn't trip over anything as he couldn't see properly. He suddenly realized Reg wasn't next to him anymore. He turned around to see where his friend had gone, only to find he had stopped in the middle of the path some distance behind him. Jimmy walked back to Reg and asked his old mate what he was up to, but Reg just stared and pointed over to the mine shafts. Jimmy followed his gaze, and suddenly a creeping tingle ran up his spine. In the dimming light, Jimmy could make out the old mine entrance, where he could also see a figure moving. As he stared in disbelief, it looked to him like it was a miner, and he was working away, not paying any attention to the two boys at all. The man had a see-through quality to him that made Jimmy pull on Reg's arm that it was time to go. As Reg finally came to his senses, they both sped off at top speed, shouting and hollering up the track towards home. That was over 20 years ago now, and Reg and Jimmy still say that they saw the ghost of a miner that night. They were not close up to him, but his presence affected them so that their hair stood up on end until they got home. Their friends and family may have thought they were drunk or lying if it had not been for the local vicar, who also used the old track through Marvel Bank on a regular basis at the time. He had been using the track as a shortcut from one side of the village to the other. He rode his bike everywhere, and so one night after visiting one of his elderly flock, he was speeding down the track past the mines when all of a sudden he saw a miner pushing a cart right out in front of him. He pulled hard on his brakes and tried to avoid the man, but in doing so ended up flying over his handlebars and landing in a heap on the verge. The vicar was shocked, and so it took a while for him to pull himself together. When he managed to get to his feet, he looked around for the miner to see if he was okay, but he couldn't see him anywhere, and there was nowhere he could have gone. Suddenly a creepy feeling came over the vicar, and his hair stood up on end. He knew the mines hadn't been used in years, and that what he must have seen was an image from the past. His bike wheel was badly buckled, and the hair was still standing up on his head. He quickly chucked the remains of his bike into the verge and ran off down the track into the village. Not surprisingly, the vicar stopped taking the shortcut after that. He would rather spend an extra few minutes going the long way than to risk another frightening run-in with the ghostly miner, and the local children kindly returned his bicycle to him as he would not go and get it himself. There have been no recent reports of the miner, and hopefully after such a grisly death he may finally be at peace. The Dungeon. Wichester Donjon is a stone-built keep that was built in 1080 and raises a glass nicely to the original name of the local area. The word donjon is French and over time has probably altered to mean dungeon, and so this gives you an idea of what Wichester Donjon was built for. In its lifetime, it did serve as a small prison, but now is open to the public for tours and events. If memory serves me correct, I first met the custodian of Wichester Donjon in the summer of 1990. The keep was holding a battle reenactment one weekend, and after having to stay an extra night in dark Shivering for work, I decided to visit the donjon for the first time on the Saturday morning. The place was buzzing with excitement, and I remember the air was filled with the smell of pig roast, which I decided I would definitely partake of later. After chatting to the custodian, Mark Duval, whilst watching the battle commence, he offered to give me a tour of the keep whilst the bodies piled up outside. The keep is a large square tower with 4 square turrets at each corner. It looks a basic design from the outside, but once inside it is a maze of corridors, spiral staircases and halls, all leading on to different levels and sections. I was really enjoying my tour with Mark. He was able to bring the dungeon to life in his storytelling, and he was obviously very passionate about the building and its history. At that point he had been the custodian for over 15 years and had private rooms within the property that he lived in. Strangely enough, I wasn't the person to mention ghosts whilst on the tour. It was something Mark obviously included in his storytelling to the public. In fact, he said that if he didn't cover the topic himself, someone would always request a ghost story or two anyway, and so it became the norm. We had just entered the lower level of the keep, which he called the dungeon. It had over 20 small prison cells in, and they looked filthy, dark and dingy. The air felt damp, and the metalwork of the bars looked rusted and malformed after years of neglect. Whilst stood in the dark vastness, he told me about the wailing, screaming and moaning that could be heard from this area at night. He said that he made sure he was up in his apartment each night by sundown, as it was at the top of the building and the screams and cries could not be heard from there. If he had happened to return home late one night, he would always make a dash from the front entrance straight up to his apartment, and leaving lights on after dark was a must to keep his sanity in check. Interestingly, as part of its long history, the dungeon had also had a curse put upon it in the winter of 1684 by a family of travelers. The year 1684 is widely regarded to have had the coldest winter in British history, and this was the year the River Thames froze for more than 2 months. The family of travelers were in Wichester looking for warmth and shelter. The father of the family had gone to the dungeon asking for help for his daughter, who was tormented by high fever, but the dungeon door was firmly shut in his face. That night the daughter died whilst freezing conditions ravaged their makeshift shelter in the woods. The mother was bitter at the loss of her only child, and in the darkest hours of the night she went back to the dungeon and cursed its very foundations with incantations and spells of old. The dungeon would forever be bestowed with bad luck until its gateway lay beneath a freezing white blanket. The village people thought this curse would never be able to be lifted. So, for hundreds of years thereafter, the donjon was filled with unhappy families, unhappy workers and unhappy prisoners. The dungeon overflowed with unnatural death, murder, suicide, torture, and rape. Doom was at every cornerstone with no end in sight of the curse being lifted. That is until Christmas Day in 1927. The country awoke to heavy snowfall, and at Wichita Dungeon, the gateway was covered in snowdrifts up to 20 feet high. The curse had finally been broken, too late for many who passed through its long history, but its future certainly looked brighter. Mark Duval feels that by day Wichita Dungeon is a warm and welcoming place where people enjoy spending time, but as the night draws in, its tragic history seems to take over the ambience and can leave visitors terrified. There are lots of documented sightings of two particular ghosts at the dungeon, and both have been seen by independent witnesses spanning the decades. The nicest one seems to be an old parlor maid who can be seen carrying out her daily duties in the scullery as if still hard at work. When she has been seen, an air of homeliness and warmth is felt in an altogether motherly way. People have been shocked and scared by her, but she seems to mean no harm and does not interact with the living. As well as being seen in the scullery, she is often spotted going back and forth to the courtyard where there is an old well and also a herb garden. Witnesses have all described the same woman, wearing a cream dress with a white apron. She has gray hair piled up in a bun and is firm in stature. The other ghost often seen is not so nice in character. This is again a female spirit who has a nasty habit of chasing people down corridors. When Mark told me of this old hag, as he calls her, whilst stood in one of the many long empty hallways, my hair stood up on end, and I could imagine just how terrifying this would be. The woman is said to be quite large but dirty looking, with long grey straggly hair around her face, wearing a stained, worn old dress. Her teeth are rotten and she brings with her a smell of sulfur. One report was from a fire inspector who had been assessing the building for fire safety. It just so happened to be October when he visited, and around Halloween, the donjon holds many Halloween parties and events. The man was busy writing on his clipboard and looking at the fire doors when he heard a commotion further down the corridor. He looked up to see what was happening, and to his surprise he saw a woman shrieking and running down the corridor at him. It all happened in a flash, but as it was close to Halloween, he thought that the dungeon had employed staff to dress up and scare the visitors. Well, he was in for a shock when the woman hurtled towards him with no sign of slowing down. He raised his arms above his head to get ready for the inevitable impact when nothing but a blast of cold air hit him. He looked around him and the woman had vanished. There was nowhere she could have gone. But what made his skin really crawl was the insane laughter that echoed down the corridor. The fire inspector shifted himself into high gear and ran from the dungeon, even leaving behind him his vehicle, which had to be collected by a colleague the next day as he refused to return. This scary apparition seems to enjoy terrifying people, and there is at least one report every year of her chasing someone down the long lonely passages. The worst story about her is when a couple of kids in the late 60s broke into the dungeon for a dare. They found themselves wandering down one dark hallway, and unfortunately for them, she was waiting at the end for them. When their torches picked up this gnarled old hag running at full speed towards them, they panicked and began running in the opposite direction, only to find to their horror she was once again in front of them. The only way they could escape her was to jump out of one of the broken windows in the middle of the hallway. This they did, and with obvious results. 2 broken legs each and a long stay in hospital. A mental hospital. The other story that sticks in one's mind about the old hag is from a tourist who wrote to Mark after his experience whilst touring the dungeon. He wrote that after the tour, he had wanted to go back to one of the great halls and take some pictures of the beautiful carved oak paneling. On his way back to the hall, he mindlessly wandered down the passageway when from behind he heard shrieking and footfalls gaining pace on him. He turned around to see a beast of a woman charging at him, and in sheer terror he took off running himself. When he got to the hall, he sped in and slammed the door shut behind him, pushing himself against it whilst puffing and panting, looking for an escape route. The noise behind the door stopped, and he stood there for what seemed like a lifetime, not breathing, just listening. After an eternity, he thought it may be safe to at least breathe, but still stood stiff, holding the wooden door shut. As he was beginning to think his ordeal was over, and in his head was trying to process what he had seen, The old hag's arm and hand came shooting through the door next to him and started grabbing at his shirt. He could take no more and literally flew to the door on other side of the hall where he made his escape. He sprinted past the next tour group and heard one of them cry out with glee that they just couldn't wait to see whatever he had. Mark showed me the letter that he had received, and true to his word, this man's story was enough to give a grown man the shivers. How Mark lived, and in fact still lives in Winchester Dungeon, is beyond me, especially with the stories he has told me. Nothing is known about the old hag ghost. Her history or why she might be haunting the dungeon is unknown. Maybe she is a member of a family long past who was deranged in her lifetime, who knows, but one thing is for sure, she is certainly deranged in this one. The old Color Works factory. The Color Works factory sits just behind a row of 1920s council houses. Their 50-foot gardens stretch down to its 7-foot-high wall, which runs the whole perimeter of its 5,000 square meters. The factory has been there since the late 1800s and was a paint shop up until its closure in the 1950s. It employed over 50 local men and more from surrounding areas, so its closure was felt by the families in the village, as this forced them to look for work further away from home. The large site not only houses the main factory, but also many smaller buildings. Mostly single-story storage facilities. The land and buildings have been for sale since the 1950s, but as it cannot be used to build residential buildings on due to undermining, it has remained a derelict plot. The villagers of Dark Shivering have embraced the factory as part of their landscape. Its worn but still charming multicolored Color Works sign still hangs proudly above its flaking painted doors and rusted entry gates. Surprisingly, the signs have fared well over the years, and even though the colors would have been much bolder in their heyday, the now pastel lettering is still readable through the age of time. I passed the Color Works factory every time I stayed in Dark Shivering. I never knew much about it, but the factory was an impressive sight to behold. It had the look of an old-fashioned hospital about it. It had a large clock in the center of the building above the main doors, but sadly its hands were long turned to dust. It boasted a mansard roof filled with windows along its edges. It was very ornamental in its construction and betrayed in all its features that it was once a paint factory. It wasn't until I happened upon chatting to an old retired security guard who had worked at the site, that I found out the old factory had a few ghost stories of its own. We had met in the gardens of the Dark Shivering Inn. It was a lovely warm summer's evening and we were both enjoying the late sunshine with an after-dinner cognac. Ron, the security guard, shared with me the following tale. I was working for a security company back in the 1960s. They had many different sites to keep secure, and the Color Works factory was a new job for us. Our company's main source of work was old industrial sites, ones which were no longer in use, but still owned by various companies, and they had value to the land. As guards we were used to working alone through the night. The buildings were empty and full of echoes, but you took it all in your stride. The Color Works had been closed for many years at this point, but a large company from the city was using its outbuildings as a short-term storage solution. A guard was required at night from 6 p.m. and you wouldn't see anyone until 6 a.m. the next morning, when the gaffer would arrive to open the storage buildings back up. It was a quiet job and there was never any trouble whilst I was there. The biggest problem for the security company was getting a guard to work there. Most only worked one night and refused to go back. I was probably one of the guards who lasted the longest. I worked 1 month exactly at the Color Works before the company who were using it found alternative storage closer to their offices in the city. Our base for the evening shift was set up in one of the smaller buildings on the grounds. It was about 300 feet from the main building and was being hugged on all sides by brambles trailing up the walls. It was only 1 story and had just 2 small rooms, one being a toilet and the other was where we sat. There was an old desk in the corner with a fireside wing-back chair behind it. In the opposite corner was a heater which took the edge off the chill in the night. As part of our nightly duty we had to walk around the factory and site perimeter every hour, including inside the main factory. One of our gaffers would visit us once throughout the night shift to make sure everything was okay. Funnily enough, he visited the Color Works factory before dark just after 6 p.m. each time and never stayed long to chat. I had only started on the job a few days before the most unnerving things started to happen every night at the same time of 11:30. A dark figure of a man would walk past the office window. Now, the first couple of times this happened, I checked the whole area, but found nothing, and the next few times it happened I tried to get a good look at him. Each time he came past my window he would scare me, as he would catch me off guard. So one night I pressed my face right up to the glass for a good look, and when I saw him I wish I hadn't. He came gliding by as usual, but this time I could see he was in a soldier's uniform. He only looked like a young man, and to my surprise and terror, as he passed the window he turned his head and stared straight at me. The only thing was, he didn't have any eyes in his sockets. Just black empty holes on a ghastly white face. Well, I fell back onto the desk and didn't move for what seemed like forever. After each visit from the soldier, the office would go bitterly cold and stayed that way for a couple of hours. At this point I knew the place was obviously haunted, but I needed the job, and to be honest I didn't think anyone would believe me. From that night on I never looked at that man again, and even put up some makeshift curtains lest he should come up to the window looking for me. The ghost of a soldier wasn't the only problem with the place, and to be honest, as soon as I arrived there for my very first shift I felt a weird feeling from the factory itself. I do wonder whether the apparition was really a soldier or something darker trying to purposely scare me. It felt like you were being watched from the windows as you walked around outside. Sometimes it seemed as though shadows flitted across those black empty windows. I don't know why the factory had a bad feeling to it. As far as I'm aware, there were no tragic accidents and no one ever died there. The strange thing was, that one night you could walk around the whole site and feel perfectly fine. There was surprisingly little graffiti on the walls, the odd upside-down cross and pentagram here and there that teenagers had probably sprayed to amuse each other. But on other nights you had to push yourself to move through the corridors and brace yourself when you opened each internal door, almost waiting for someone to jump out on you from the other side. Fear could literally freeze you to the spot. The factory was a large stone-built building, and on those nights when the atmosphere was bad, you could hear voices in the empty rooms. If you tried to listen to what was being said, they would stop, but if you kept walking through the building there was a permanent conversation going on that you were not invited to. Sometimes you could hear footsteps following behind you, but no one was ever there. The voices and footsteps were almost as if they were trying to give you the creeps, knowing you were there alone and vulnerable. On my last night at the Color Works, my gaffer came in before dark as usual and thanked me for working there. He told me that he had difficulty in getting any of the other guards to work on that site, and if I hadn't have stayed he would have had to end the contract early. After a brief chat he left and I worked my last night. It wasn't a good night particularly. The dark figure had already walked past my window and had left my room icy cold. A chill went down my back and I thought I may as well go and do my security check. I was almost finished inside the factory when I heard what I thought sounded like an animal growling. It didn't sound like a dog, but more like a monster you would see in a scary film. It was loud and guttural and froze me to the spot with all my hairs tingling. I felt very certain at that moment that I must get out of there immediately, but I didn't want to run. I felt like whatever or whoever was in there would start chasing after me like a predator. It was like slowly backing away from a lion. I walked backwards all the way through the main reception room and bumped into the front door. As I awkwardly twisted my body to get the door open, I took my eyes off the room to look at what I was doing, and boom, as soon as I did that I felt something running towards me. I couldn't see anything, but in my head I knew there was something going to attack me. I slid through the gap in the door and slammed it hard behind me. As I shakily put the key in the lock and turned it, something banged into the door from inside. It was such an explosion of noise and power I thought the door was going to come off its hinges. I ran back over to my office and I stayed there for the rest of the night. It was still dark at 6 a.m. when other workmen arrived on site. I handed over the keys with relief and began my walk home, not before I had a last look over my shoulder, of course. And boy did I shudder as I looked at the small one-story building he'd been sat in all night, and saw a tired white face with two hollow black eyes staring back at me from the office window. The thought of him being in my office with me all night was too much for me, and I legged it home. After Ron shared his story with me, I took it upon myself to do a little digging into the history of the site to see if there were any occurrences that could account for the ghostly goings-on. I spoke to Homer Powell, who is a local historian, and he told me that dark Shivering had lost its fair share of young men in both wars, and so seeing the ghost of a soldier may not be particularly out of place. More interestingly, though, one young man by the name of Herbie Jones died a particularly nasty death when he was caught up under a German tank. His body was turned to pulp, forcing his eyes to pop out of their sockets as the tank rolled over his poor lifeless body. His fellow comrades never found his eyes, and he was returned home to dark Shivering without them. He was buried up in what is now known as Devil's Church graveyard alongside a few other fallen men. It would seem by the sad figure that Ron saw most nights at the Colorworks factory that maybe Herbie Jones cannot rest to this day, wandering the night searching for his eyes. I have no idea why he would choose the Colorworks factory. Maybe locals used to walk through there as a shortcut. All I do know is that I have a very reliable witness who saw him on many occasions, in fact too many for his own liking. The Old Cotton Mill. The Old Mill Business Park is what used to be called the Old Grantley Cotton Mill. The site now consists of 3 long but narrow buildings that each have 4 floors plus a basement. The largest and main building has a warehouse-type structure attached at one end that regularly sees lorries coming and going and forklift trucks zipping around. The main part of this building is now used as offices for different businesses. There is a large graveled area in front of the mill, big enough to host lorries coming and going, and it has a sweeping driveway up from the main road. Although the water wheel is still attached to the building, it is rotting badly and needs attention at some point. Grantley Mill was first opened in 1790 and was a typical carbon copy of most working mills of its day. It was rather, in fact, a poorhouse that worked men, women and children until its closure in 1930. Its working conditions were poor, which is not unusual, and it offered no comfort to the many families who were forced to work there or die. Whilst on business mainly in the 1980s, the business park is somewhere that I had to visit on a regular basis, as one of my long-standing clients rented office space on the 3rd floor. I actually enjoyed visiting this huge space that oozed history from every orifice. It has long characterless hallways on each level, but the offices that come off them are bright and airy and are a pleasure to be in, especially in the summer with the sun streaming through the windows. Renting some of the offices at the time was a catalog company, a double glazing firm, a charity organization, a chartered surveyor, a landscaping company and a distribution agency who used the warehouse. There is more space available to rent, which means that a lot of the offices are left empty until let. Whenever I arrived on site, I would have a coffee in the rest area with whoever was about. The people who worked there all knew each other and were very friendly, which sometimes led you to forget that they didn't all work for the same company. The girls from the catalog office were particularly chatty and friendly and were always glad of an excuse for a tea break. They especially liked to fill me in on the ghostly goings-on that they swear happened at the mill. I always listened to their stories. Sometimes they would keep me there way past my planned departure time. Marlene especially had one story she liked to tell of what she called the creeper, and so I'll share it with you now. Marlene had been working there for nearly 10 years. In fact, they were the first company to rent office space there. Over this time, other companies had come and gone, and so the building has had highs and lows in terms of the volume of people on site. Marlene had been working there for over a year when her workload changed. She began dealing with work from other countries and so had to be in the office until midnight on a shift pattern with the other girls. At first she didn't think anything of being alone in the building until late, as there was always a security guard who sat in reception and patrolled the grounds. It was her first late night shift, and walking down the long corridors and empty stairwells left a chill up her spine that she had never experienced before. She put it down to it being late and dark, and her mind working overtime. She said it felt as though someone was there watching you, but you couldn't see who it was. The next night, as it was nearing time for Marlene to leave, she started to feel nervous about having to walk down the corridor on her own. She had a strong feeling not to do it, but obviously had to. So out she ventured again at a fast pace, all the while thinking how glad she was that this was her last late night until the following week. During the day shift, the girls and Marlene all agreed that the building was creepy at night and none of them liked leaving the safety of their office to go home. They decided it would be a good idea to ask the night security guard to escort them from their office to their vehicles in the evening, on the pretense that it was safer for them as women working late on their own. The guard had no problem with this, and it eased their fears no end. So this is what the women in the office always did, and funnily enough, the guard said that he too felt a little uneasy walking the corridors at night on his own. Although he had never seen anything unusual, it was more the creepy feeling that made him uneasy. Everything was working out well with the arrangement, and the women felt a lot safer being escorted by the guard. Things changed, however, when the company that owns the building decided to put floor-to-ceiling length mirrors at either end of each corridor in a bid to reflect more natural light up and down the walkway from the windows. It seemed like a good idea and did make a big difference during the day to the quality of light thrown down the long passages. One night Marlene wasn't feeling too well, and at 11 p.m. she decided to leave as she had done the vast majority of her work and was struggling to concentrate. She tried to call the guard at the reception desk, but there was no answer, so she presumed he was on a patrol, and by this point she felt so unwell that she just wanted to leave straight away. She left the office and locked the door behind her, then started her way down the passage. As Marlene dragged herself along the corridor, she kept seeing a flash of movement in the mirror ahead of her. So when she got up close, she looked deep into the reflection and to her horror saw an apparition crawling along the ceiling behind her. She quickly turned to look at the actual ceiling behind her, and to her horror it really was there. Crawling in a predatory manner behind her. It looked like a shadowy, hazy image of a gremlin, but bigger and longer. It moved almost like a frog crawling along and was easily the size of a small human. As she stared in disbelief, her eyes began to water with terror, and she had to force herself to run as quickly as she could out of the building. It was after this that Marlene requested their office be moved from the third floor to the first floor. At the time she was frightened beyond belief, but over time she tries not to think about it so she can carry on working there. None of the other staff have ever seen this creeper, but Marlene won't look in the corridor mirrors anymore. She thinks maybe this creeper entity stays up on the third floor. Well, that's what she's hoping anyway. Marlene liked to tell this story and it never changed. It was always the same. One day not long after hearing this story, I was talking to the security guard one night and he had an idea as to why the building might be haunted. He told me that when the building was being refurbished, the security company that he worked for had a contract to check the building nightly. One night the guard arrived on site and was met by a gang of boys screaming and running from the building. He managed to collar hold of one lad and asked him what the hell was going on. The boy was clearly terrified and kept fighting to get free. All he would say to the guard was that there was something on the third floor. The boy eventually managed to escape the guard's grip and sprinted off down the driveway. The guard went into the mill and searched everywhere for signs of a break-in. He could see that the boys had all scrambled through a first-floor window left open by the builders and so secured it and continued on upstairs. When he got to the third floor, which at the time was one large open space awaiting refurbishment, he found the remnants of a Ouija board, some candles and a pentagram. The guard realized what the boys had been up to and thought they must have scared themselves silly. He probably chuckled to himself thinking of the teenagers hot-footing it back to their mums. It may be a coincidence, but something scared those boys, and maybe it was the same thing that scared Marlene. The basement is another area that people who work at the mill don't like. It is a vast area and stretches the whole length of the building. It is filled with pipes, cables and a heating system. The walls are made from dirty, crumbling old bricks and the air feels damp. The businesses above are allowed to store small items down there, like fans, heaters, and desk etc. And so on the odd occasion people do brave the dark, dingy space. When they do though, many have reported hearing voices down there. People have heard muffled conversations, a woman screaming and a man hissing, "Get out." I can only think that these voices are echoes from the past. From the poor unfortunate people who found themselves in what was a soul-destroying place many years ago. Another ghost who is said to haunt the mill is that of a small boy. He is on the first floor and most people who work there have seen him. To all intents and purposes he looks like a real, solid little boy, and most staff when they first see him assume it is someone's child visiting the workplace. He seems happy enough and people have reported a child's laughter and chattering. The ladies from the catalogue have left a toy box in the reception seating area and mysteriously when no one is looking the toys get moved around the room. His favorite toy seems to be a small brown teddy bear that he likes to put on one of the chairs. I thought it was very sad for a little boy to be left behind like that, but the catalogue ladies assure me he is always happy. Dark Shivering has lots more stories to give up, and I'm always collecting them for future books. Join me next time for more haunting tales of Dark Shivering. Don't forget to click, like, and subscribe so you never miss another ghostly episode.